This is an unrehearsed program. The views expressed are those of the guests and not necessarily those of the producer. Today's topic:
The America's Choice of Allies in Passion for Truth.
Welcome to another edition of Passion for Truth. The State Department issued rude reports on human rights abuses in some countries, but the Pentagon gave generous finance and training to the countries that we consider as our allies in our war on terror. As an example, the dictators in both Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan, both oil-rich countries, have been trying to resist reform, but the U.S. is calling them as its allies. Does Washington have a split personality in foreign policy, or do we rely on dictators out of sheer diplomacy? We'll ask our panelists next. Dee Lacy, Hester, Director, Conflict Resolution and Reconciliation Program. Dennis Jones, Political Analyst from Northern Virginia. Khalid Jilani, Political Analyst, also a chair of the Asian Task Force of the United Nations Association National Capital Area, founder of Institute of Cultural Intelligence, and Fred Peterson, Senior Policy Advisor for Defense with Institute of Religion and Public Policy. Surekha Vij, journalist from New York, also she has written several articles for the Washington Post and the Washington Times. And Meena Bhatt, staff attorney from the Jubilee Campaign. Welcome you all. Starting with you, Meena, do we rely on dictators out of diplomacy?
I think it's an evil necessity that has to do with the nature of politics. Regardless of a hindsight view of what happens 20 years from now, it seems like the State Department or any government in that matter, in order to be successful in the globalized world, will have to deal with dictators and leaders of other countries, which we may not necessarily agree with on a political or a ideological level, but it's something that we have to do in a globalized world.
Do we maintain double standards, Surekha, in pursuing both our enemies and allies in the war on terror?
I think you're right to please give the answer to your own question. There are, if one's eye, one is a terrorist, and another eye is a freedom fighter. So I think it's been going on for a little while, and the United States has also followed this policy with double standards, just in case various days we have certain negotiations going on, and then we will allow the things to happen in that country, maybe even their dictators, or if they have been coup in that country, it hasn't been questioned, even if it's just a question of Pakistan, which happens to be a dictator sort of a country, but it's never being an ally of the United States. And as you mentioned, other two countries from the previous Soviet Union, I think there are double standards, and one should point that out.
Fred, what is it? You know, we're talking about the corrupt and autocratic ruler of Uzbekistan. He has an atrocious record of human rights abuses, as you know, and yet we consider him as an indispensable ally in our war against terror, against Muslim extremism. Is that an example of split personality?
That's a very interesting question, and it begs an absolute answer, either yes or no, and I don't believe there is an absolute answer. The comment was made that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. That is a rather glib way of saying that the term terrorist nor freedom fighter, the term freedom fighter, has any independent, verifiable, objective reality. The important point that we must all realize, all people of good faith, is that there is an objective standard by which we measure words and by which we measure actions. I would submit that there is a clear definition of a terrorist and a clear definition of a freedom fighter, which all of good faith to which they would subscribe commonly, whether they may have a different point of view on politics or religion or gender issues or any other issues. I would say that when a person is drowning, or in extremis. One does not inquire about the religion of he who comes to his aid. If you are floundering in the water, fighting a shark, and someone throws you a life buoy, you don't ask, but are you an ally or are you an enemy? Or do you subscribe to the same code of political belief or religious belief as I do? Perhaps when you climb aboard the ship and you are rescued, then you go down the category of, or the priorities of belief that one has. Belief in, or necessity of survival, I would submit, precludes the niceties of political arrangements. Political arrangements are lesser, somewhat, and then religious arrangements also are somewhat less.
Okay, let me come back
when
to
we're dealing with terrorists, when we're dealing with a war, when we are at war, there are allies which are allies of necessity, not allies necessarily of choice, but allies nonetheless. We should be judicious in selecting them, but they come to us with assistance, and that assistance in a non-perfect world is often accepted.
Holly, how do you respond to his choice of allies of necessity?
My biggest problem is not with having to deal with allies of necessity. Yes, occasionally one does have to have very strange bedfellows, I agree. However, the biggest problem for me is, do we have to, like we have done in the past in many cases, create those monsters? I think the biggest problem for me has been that countries in the West, former colonies, the United States, even the United Nations is guilty of this. We tend to support dictators, demagogues, autocrats, and what have you, and help them get to their present position. Whatever the past may have entailed, at least in the case of the United Nations, of the United States, as a second, at that time we had two world powers, the Soviet Union and the United States. So the United States said that in order to, further its own interests against the Soviet Union, you had to very often create dictatorships. Whether I agree with that premise or not, those days are gone. Today, if we really want to combat terrorism, and I work in those conflict zones all the time, I hail from the predominantly Muslim world and I work there all the time. My biggest problem is that if we're going to solve the problem, we have to look for leaders who will actually serve their people instead of exploiting them. We have to support people who are democratic, who are humanitarian, who believe in, giving back to their people rather than grabbing from them and killing them with impunity. And we just look away and support those murderers. That has to stop. If we on occasion have to, deal with a dictator who's already there, well, that's the reality on the ground.
Dennis, where do you come on? Occasional diplomacy?
Well, I think that the question goes much further than that. It's, we talk about, we have definitions of what a terrorist is, but 3 years prior, when we were training them to fight the Soviets, they were not terrorists, they were freedom fighters. But then all of a sudden they turn and they say, well, we don't like you because we didn't like what you wanted to do, but we were willing to work with you to get rid of one master, and they attack us. We then label them as a terrorist. We support the Chinese because they would label a group that they didn't like as a dissident group and say, oh, they're terrorists, you've got to support us. We've done the same with other countries. I don't think that at the end of the day we can have a single definition. I agree that you do have to look at who you have to do business with, but at the same time, we as a country should have some standards that says we don't have to necessarily get in bed with a dictator just because of the fact that we want to solve the problem in that country. Because 9 times out of 10, the people that he's oppressing, the people that Holly thinks that we should be dealing with, well, they've been thrown in jail and been labeled a terrorist by their dictator government, which means that we automatically are precluded from talking to them without looking as if we're going against those that we have to stay in power.
Where do you come on?
I agree with the comments of some of my co-panelists at the table. I think that really it is a matter of, the primary question is what is in the national security of the United States. When you're talking about whether or not the United States acts in a manner that demonstrates a split personality or not, I don't think so. I don't think there's so much double standards as there are what is best for the national security interests of the country. The difficulty is when
you try to, when the government leaders have to reconcile what needs to be done in the short term and immediately with what we would desire in the long run. And that is where it becomes more complex and much more difficult. And I think if you look at what you believe would be in the national security interest of the country, then you will begin to better understand where the United States is coming from when it's making its decisions.
Nina, if we tolerate friendly dictators, how do we export democracy to other countries then?
I'm not sure if it's our job to per se export democracy as it is to lead democracy, which is a big difference. Exporting may mean a more active rather than passive movement, where if you're in a passive movement, is you show the system that you've established and why it's successful through knowledge, through teaching, through education on a grassroots level. I agree with Holly, we need to find the leaders who are sympathetic and will lead and will represent their people and not exploit them. But on the same sense, it has to be a grassroots movement within that state, that sovereign state. So for you to ask whether we should export democracy, I don't think that's for our responsibility to do. Mind you, if we lead democracy in a more passive way where you use yourself as a shining example, like a beacon on top of a hill, then you've got yourself a more viable way of doing it. Because whenever you enter into a country and you say this is the way it should be, what you do is you breed hostility on the grassroots level and at the grassroots level, which is something that will at the end be counterproductive, and there's no way you'll find success.
But how do we then promote international standards and norms of behaviors that we in U.S. ourselves are not prepared to observe?
Well, I mean, that goes back again, and I agree with you that we cannot impose anything. What we can do is work through either we actively support the international organizations that we have signed on board with and try to support it, or we support it through NGOs, or we support it through other means. But we as a country cannot be perceived as coming out and solving the problems for other people or establishing norms. What we can do, again, and I agree with Nina, it goes back to if we are living the way we claim the system works, if we are doing those things, people will automatically, and every time I go to a foreign country, people want to have what Americans have. They don't dislike America. They don't hate Americans. What they dislike is being told by America that you can only have it under these conditions. What they're saying is, help us figure out a way to have it, but let us do it on our own with your support. And I think if we actually adhere to those things and more actively support it, I'm a bigger fan of supporting the NGOs than I am the UN, simply because of the fact that the UN is a bureaucracy and there are more political entities trying to vie for their internal power and ability to stay in power than they are to actually help those on the ground. We can support the NGOs. We can give them the room to go in. If necessary, provide them with armed escorts if necessary so that they can do their job. Let them go in, let them work with the grassroots organizations, and then from there we step back. And whatever happens, happens, but be willing to deal with the people honestly once they've come to some determination about the system that they're going to have.
What's your take?
I think that really, if you say that we're tolerating dictators, how can we export democracy or promote the norms and ideals that we as Americans believe in? Sometimes if you look at a situation where you have an actual dialogue with someone that you think could do better in a variety of ways, it opens doors and opportunities where that you would not have if you had no direct communication with them. That's not to say that direct communication is always the best method of promoting the ideals that you believe in, but I do believe that opportunities arise when you have a dialogue with them.
May I add something to that? I think what Dennis said is fundamentally correct, but you've got to make a difference between whom you're dealing with. If you're looking at a particular country, you might have a huge disconnect between the population and the ruler. Whom do you deal with there? Whom do you establish those norms for? Whom do you become the shining example for? You cannot sideline the population by just dealing with the dictator, and you cannot simply ignore the dictator and we've got to fight for those people. You've got to find something that is going to be able to bring the two together, and something that's going to function where both sides are going to be at least somewhat taken care of and not just one. But one of the other things that Dennis mentioned is supporting the NGOs in certain areas. I see in Iraq itself, the only two operational groups are one, the military, and two, the NGOs out in the field. You do not have a State Department out there. You do not have bureaucracies out there. Everybody else is confined to a green zone somewhere or a Camp Victory or someplace in Baghdad and never come out of the wire. For those of us who are actually operational out in the war zones, it is very important that we work together and that we each give of ourselves to the other in order to succeed in being able to give the population something. And this little panel here, whereas it can address the question to some extent, is simply not the forum that's big enough and long enough for us to go into all of this in detail.
Where are you on it, Africa?
I as my colleague over here just mentioned, that there is no perfect world. And if we are setting up an example for any kind, if we are going to tell somebody that follow democracy or follow this kind of principle, morality or human rights, so we have to set an example. And if we are not able to set an example, and then we do not have moral grounds and we say we are not perfect. Nobody's perfect. And that means we are just leaving that kind of loose hole over there. But to be able to set an example, we have to have a certain principles. We have to stick to it. If we do not like the dictators, we have to say that we do not like the dictators, even if they are not our allies or if they are not our allies. Or if we are supporting democracy, we have to support democracy in the same way. Maybe there can be a little bit of concession, but to be able to set an example, you have to have certain moral grounds. And just to loosely say that there's no perfect world, then it seems that it's a double standard then.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about what about the U.S. double standards, negotiates treaties, then it opts out or fails to ratify. We criticize others for ignoring the report of UN, but we refuse to accept criticism of our own performance. We criticize North Korea and Iran while we ignore the comparable behavior in Israel, Egypt, and Morocco. Some thought-provoking questions for our panelists next when we come back. Stay with us.
Once I was traveling from Washington, a Russian diplomat was sitting with me who had spent 5 years in America. And he asked me, Ashok, what should Russia do to live like the Americans? I said, adopt the Bill of Rights and wait for 200 years. Next, there was an occasion when I was meeting one Russian governor who was at the U.S. Commerce Office, and he asked me, Ashok, what are you doing in Moscow? I said, I'm exporting the American dream. And I think these are two issues which are very important for any country. And I think the reason of terrorism or hostility towards America is because there are double standards. If the double standards are adopted to solve the problem, I think it's not going to solve the problem. The double standards only create the problem, and that's what I think the America has to decide once and for all.
Very good question. Okay.
May I quickly address what Ashok said? I have a problem in, we give America a lot of responsibilities, and yet since time immemorial, please look at the history of every imperialist, colonialist, world power, invader, conqueror, what have you. They have never cared for the interests of whatever country they thought was in their own vital, strategic, political, or military interests. America actually has set a new precedent on the world stage in that as the only world power today, they are actually interested in the well-being of the countries that they either invade or go into for whatever interests they have in that country as a world power. I think this is caused by two things. One, an increasing awareness of human rights and humanitarian, the whole humanitarian field that has suddenly become so important to us theoretically post-World War I and practically post-World War II. The other thing is we have a huge big global media now that in a second is there capturing images that could embarrass any government that's perpetrating wrongs on a certain population. However, and this I have to say, America will make mistakes because there is no precedent in history that it can fall back on. What I say is, for goodness sake, Make the unavoidable mistakes. Don't keep on making avoidable mistakes. What I tell my students, whether they're Marines or soldiers, learn from history. Do not repeat the same mistakes that colonialists and imperialists of the past have made. History is extremely important.
We are willing, Fred, to forgive India, Israel, and Pakistan for having nuclear weapons while demonizing Iran and North Korea. Is that acceptable or not a case of a double standard?
Again, I would make the point that we are not dealing with absolutes here. We are dealing with a finite world, a world of comparative goods and comparative bads. I don't think any responsible commentator of good faith would equate the behavior of North Korea or the irresponsible behavior most recently and to date today and the threat to world peace that is Iran with the behavior of India. India has, or I should say, Pakistan for that matter, although Pakistan is teetering on the brink of, I should say, risk to its own hegemony over its own people, and Israel as well. I don't, it's almost not sustainable in an intellectual argument to draw, if one draws equations, because nuclear weapons exist in this state, then there is an equivalence in the behavior of another state. Who can say North Korea is not, I mean, would we not acknowledge that North Korea is a greater threat and to world peace and an absolute a horror to its own people in terms of human rights, apart from the security issues to its neighbors, the way they treat their own people?
Yeah, and final thoughts on each of our panelists. Should we rely on dictators out of necessity as long as we don't actively participate in making them dictators of their own, of their respective countries? Yes or no? Starting with you, DeLacy.
The United States has a difficult role to play and a privileged role to play as the leader in the modern world in almost every way. When we are dealing with our foreign policy, the first role of government of the United States federal government is to ensure that it protects its citizens, as is the first role of any government, is to protect its own citizens. That always is kept in mind in foreign policy, but what the decision makers have to struggle with so much is, excuse me, the impact of the decisions that they make on others. It is not always a positive one, and by others I mean those outside the United States. So it's a complex issue. Actually, it can't be given a simple answer.
Dennis?
I think that it goes back to just we will do what we need to do to further our national interest, but we must also do so with the respect or a modicum of respect for the peoples that we have to be engaged with, not just the governments, but the peoples themselves, because at some point in time, that leader will die. At some point in time, there will be a change. We have to be in a position to where we have enough respect from both the administrations that we deal with and their peoples that when there is a change, we still have a positive relationship in the end.
I absolutely agree with Dennis. Being the only world power in the world comes with both benefits and responsibilities, and that means benefits and responsibilities not only to your own people, but to those who live outside of the United States. The fact that it's the only world power, I do not have any choice in. However, what one can fight for is to see that it is a world power with responsibility and with respect, both self-respect as well as the respect of other countries.
Prior to World War I, the United States assiduously refrained from engaging in world politics, except as they affected our hemisphere, except as they affected the United States very directly. We were dragged kicking and screaming into World War I and rapidly withdrew from the world stage, rapidly withdrew from our own creation, the League of Nations. World War II occurred quite apart from the United States influence, and because the United States has withdrawn. The United States then withdrew, and World War II came, and at the end of the war, we were about the last nation standing. And there is still a significant opinion within the United States and a commonality among this panel, I might say, that we do not consider it our mission to convert the world to anything, but we do consider it our mission to preserve ourselves and to hold ourselves up as a lamp to the world for emulation. I think that is a note that upon which we all should be able to agree.
I think to be able to hold the lamp to the world, one has to have a role model. And then for that, I will just give a small little example. One time a little child was eating sugar, and he went to Mahatma Gandhi and asked, his mother went to the Mahatma Gandhi and said, "My child is eating sugar. Could you tell him not to eat sugar?" So Gandhi, he said that, "Can you come after 2 weeks?" So the mother went back home and wondering, why couldn't you tell my child right away not to eat sugar? But she went back after 2 weeks and she asked Mahatma Gandhi. He says, "Yeah, I can tell the child now not to eat sugar." So she said, "But why did you take too long and 2 weeks to tell him?" He says, "Because I was eating sugar myself. So before I could stop myself eating sugar, I couldn't tell the child not to eat sugar." So I guess this conveys the whole meaning of the whole thing. To be able to tell the world, you have to first preserve those values.
Milan, you have the last word.
I just think that it's a multifaceted issue, which means that the answer is not just one exact solution. It looks like, if you are going to deal with an absolute government, a government that you don't agree with their ideologies or their politics or the way they came into power, but at the same time, if you have chosen to deal with them and if you made that decision to deal with them, then you have to also deal with their people, you have to deal with their culture, their education, their level of history, and then you have to take that all together and combine it in order to understand who you're dealing with and whether it's worth it or not. And once you have that understanding, you can make the decision and have to live with the decision, unfortunately.
And that's all the time we have. Is there another issue, especially for truth? Thank you.
If you have any question, comment, or suggestion on this program, please send us an email at mschawla@hotmail.com or write to us at 1011 Salt Meadow Lane, McLean, Virginia, 22101. Please watch GTV programs every week at the same station and at the same time, and send your comments to mschawla@hotmail.com.